We have Ms. Shreya Gadepalli, who is the founder and managing trustee of the Urban Works Institute, but also an independent director with the Chennai Smart City, and also a founder emeritus of the Institute for Transportation and Development Policies India program. We have also Mr. Thomas Kiewit, who is the Director of Planning of the Suburban region in Stuttgart, Germany, and also Professor Jay Dodson, Director of the Center for Urban Research at the RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. We want to keep this event interactive in nature. So here are the ground rules. Each expert will make a 5-minute presentation defining the problem, identifying the causes, and proposing solutions for the specific city or region. Then after a brief discussion with the panelists, we will open it for questions and answers by all of you. Therefore, please pose your questions at any time, starting from the start of the presentations at the Q&A box. I will have also the opportunity to pose them to the panelists. If you're facing any other technical issues, you can use the chat box. Finally, for IURC cities that have joined us today and that wish to take this discussion further and are considering this topic as the focus of their IURC engagement, they should contact us after the event. So the key objective of this session is to answer this question: how to reinstate public systems and non-motorized transport means as better ways of city transport in the post-COVID world. And this is an important question because it's relevant to the economy, to society, but also to climate. And it's something that cities can take action upon and also learn from each other. So with no further delay, I will now give the virtual floor to Ms. Gadepalli for her presentation.
Thank you very much. It's great to be co-hosting this session with IURC, and thanks for inviting us to be a part of it. And thanks for that introduction. Like you have said, I will be speaking about the case of Chennai, but I'll only start with the case of Chennai to build how Indian cities are and what they have been in the past, but also show what is happening at the national level, at a pan-India level, in terms of bringing back better transport, especially as a means of green recovery from COVID. The next slide, please. Now, Chennai is a city in the south of India, previously called Madras. It's the 4th largest city in the country and has actually one of the better public transport systems in the country. And yet, if you start looking at how many buses does the city have, you realize that city has only half the buses it needs. Over the last decade, even though the population has significantly grown, the population grew by 30%, the number of buses in the city has not grown. And this is the story of many Indian cities. Now, because of this, if you were to go to the next slide, you would see that 4 out of 10 citizens actually do not have access to buses. So this is a study that we at the Urban Works Institute had done for the Institute for ITDP India program, looking at what is the accessibility of public transport in the city, mapping all the buses and their frequencies and the population in different parts of the city. And we realized that only 6 out of 10 people actually even have a bus stop within 10 minutes. And if you look at frequent services, that number drops down even further. Now, obviously, if you do not have even access to public transport, how would you use public transport, right? The next point that I'd like to show is that even if you actually were to have a bus stop, it's actually very hard to reach the bus stop. You realize that in Chennai, 85% of the bus stops are hard to reach on foot. Now, this number is actually a good number because Chennai over the last decade, with help from us, has been building better streets to have better accessibility, so good footpaths, and has done a lot of work in terms of improving foot access. And yet you realize that 85% of people do not have access to public transport. And the result of this is, if you see on the next slide, obviously, when you do not have good access and you do not even have the buses, the ridership is bound to fall. Back in the day, a decade back, Chennai used to have nearly 6 million people on public transport, on its bus services in the city every day, 6 million trips every day. And that number has been constantly dropping over the decade. And because of COVID was like a death blow, the number has fallen to something like 1.4 million people. Now, even the metro system, which is actually built on one of the nicer, better corridors in the city, has only 1/7 of the projected initial ridership. Next, please. And meanwhile, if you look at the number of private motor vehicles, they've been constantly growing over the past decade. And these are figures not just for Chennai, but across the whole country. And the number, as you can see on the leftmost graph, has been constantly rising. And while it dropped significantly due to COVID, that was only a minor dip. It has rebounded and people are buying again more vehicles. And we had even done a survey where we found that people were afraid of using public transport and they were planning to buy personal motor vehicles. And what this has done is that our cities in India are severely congested. TomTom, which does this survey every year, found in the 2019 survey that 4 out of the top 10 most congested and polluted cities in the country, in the world, were actually in India: Bangalore, Mumbai, Pune, and Delhi. And COVID has only created the problem, made it even more severe because people have started even fearing public transport. And public transport right now in most cities in India is less than half of what it used to be. Ridership is less than half of what it used to be. Now, what do we do in such a situation? Next, please. This is what then the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs at the Government of India decided that we need to do something about it. And it started these 3 phenomenal programs, which were to promote cycling, walking, and public transport. The first one, which was launched in mid-2020, was the India Cycles for Change Challenge. The next, in September last year, was Streets for People. And lastly, the Transport for All Challenge. And over 130 cities are participating in these. These challenges really were campaigns by the ministry to inspire cities to do better in walking, cycling, and public transport, to get the cities the help they need, and then compete against each other to be the best city, which is going to make walking and cycling safe and fun for everyone and public transport accessible to everyone. Next, please. And the idea behind these challenges is that it's not just the city which is going to do something. Cities are actually going to join hands with citizens and also startups and designers and others to come together with solutions which would be tested, learned from, and then scaled. And that's precisely what the next slide is about. There was a new paradigm, a new mantra that cities started using, which is test, learn, and scale. So rather than saying we already know what the solutions are, cities first went and understood from citizens what the needs are. They did a variety of surveys, focus group discussions, and various ways of capturing the information from citizens. Using that to develop, co-develop solutions, test them, learn from these solutions, pilots, to see what's working, what's not working, get additional feedback, basis which improve the solutions, and then finally scale the solutions. And this is the mantra that all cities in India are actually using now. And I'd say that this is just the start. A lot more needs to be done, but it's a very promising start to start creating cities where people have access to walking, cycling, and public transport. And our future is not congested and polluted, not a death trap, but one where people's lives are enriched. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kadepalli. And before we move to the next speaker, Mr. Kiwit, I have a quick question for you. You showed this nice graph, nice aesthetically, but in a way challenging in the sense that shows the decline of ridership over time. And of course, you shown a dip at the end because of COVID, but as you mentioned, it moves downwards since the last few years. Why is that? What is the main cause of that? Have you identified that maybe?
Like I said, like the city, the population of, while the population of the city has increased by 30%, the number of buses has remained stagnant in the city. So the per capita availability of buses has reduced. So which means that people do not actually even have access to public transport. Like I showed in the map of Chennai, 40% of city doesn't even have access within a 10-minute walking distance to a bus. Now, when you do not have access to buses and the population is growing, obviously the ridership is going to reduce because people cannot anymore depend on public transport unless they are captive users for the most part, or have excellent service in their area, which might be the city core, but not in the peripheral areas. And they're also shifting, therefore, to private motor vehicles, especially motorcycles, and a shift to cars as well, which is creating the congestion that we have. Our estimate shows that the city is losing something of the order of 4,000 crore rupees. I'm sorry for the numbers. Crores in a crore is 10 million.
10 million, yes.
Right. So it's 40 billion rupees every year is what the city is losing.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Kiewit, the floor is yours, so we can hear more about the broader Stuttgart region.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and hello from Stuttgart. We have a totally different story here, as you can see on the brown graphic here. We had an increase of ridership by 30% during the last 10 years. But this success story dropped immediately due to COVID, and we had a loss of 50% of passengers in the last year. Next slide, please. What you can see on the green line is important that we have no cut of service. Despite that significant lack of passengers, we had all rolling stock out to provide a safe and reliable service. However, the strategic goal to meet 500,000 passengers every day is far away now. Next slide, please. So what are the causes for this development? Stuttgart region loves cars. We have a very high dependency in economic terms on the car manufacturing industry. The image of the car is excellent here. We are refer to ourselves as the cradle of the automobile. We have Daimler and Porsche factories. So many people earn their bread with car making, within the car making industry, many suppliers. So the whole economy is focused on cars. So it's no surprise that the modal split is about 60% done with motorized individual transport. Every adult practically has access to a car. So which also doesn't come as a surprise is that the infrastructure is at a limit. We have also problems, not just with congestion, we have also problems with the air quality, with particulate matters. So there are some restrictions in place, especially for diesel cars, for older cars. They are banned from the city center. So that what helps somewhat to meet the high standards of the European Union. But on the other hand, the accessibility for urban centers is crucial because of our settlement structures. Many cities within Stuttgart regions are small villages. So for the quality of life, it's absolutely necessary to have easy access to the city center. That's crucial for our overall structure. So that's why we focus on transit-oriented development. We use the public transport as a backbone for the provision of housing, of new jobs, of commercial areas. So we want to make sure that, for example, shopping malls, big shopping centers are always located in the city center where we can provide easy access to public transport. And so we have invested quite a lot of money to provide a 50-minute frequency of public transport all over the region. We have also invested a lot of money in the last mile solution. We provided e-scooters, bike rental systems. And of course, the quality of service is crucial here because everybody has a private car as an alternative option available. It's very important that this public transport service is seamless, is reliable, and is also comfortable. So that's where we have a strong focus on. And of course, we have sustainable mobility as a strategic goal. We want to achieve less emissions, but there are also social issues and the overall competitiveness of the location as a whole is on the very top of the political agenda. So in a nutshell, overall development goals in terms of sustainable development cannot be achieved without passengers using public transport. Next slide, please. So what we are doing now, we keep up the services despite a reduced ridership. No matter how many people use public transport, we have everything out that we have available. We have introduced an intensified cleaning and ventilation scheme. So whenever a train stops, all doors open automatically so that we can provide better ventilation. We had adapted the tariffs. We used to provide weekly and monthly passes, but with more people working from home, this is not a very beneficial structure. So we introduced a 10-ticket ridership just to keep people within the system, even if they do not buy a pass or do not have a plan with a monthly or annual pass. We want to stick them with the system, so that's why we provide another form of tickets. We had also an additional funding scheme for private, and that's mainly bus companies that depend on the direct income from the passengers. If we cannot subsidize these private companies, they will be bankrupt within a few weeks. And then we will not be able to bring the system after COVID, hopefully back on rolling, because the companies are gone. That's why we spend public money to support those private bus companies. We also came up with pop-up bike lanes, with more rental bikes. But however, even with people working from home, we stick to the principle of transit-oriented development. There is no cut down in the investment of public transport. It is seen nevertheless as a very crucial element of sustainable development within the region. And so all the strategic goals and the strategic investments will go on. I have to say, as long as tax revenue makes that feasible. Of course, we want to go digital. We want to introduce the ETCS system. That's a computerized control system that allows a higher reliability and a higher capacity, so we can bring more trains on tracks, basically. So because they do not keep the distance, because everything is controlled by computer. And as we have a federal system here, we have strong political lobbying for additional infrastructure. We need more railway tracks, we need more bike lanes, and we need the funding from the state and even from the national level. So that's where we have huge activities going on to convince those people to spend more money within our region. And of course, we go on to continue with research and development activities. We want to introduce more modern modes of transport, like self-driving vehicles, park and ride facilities. We have a traffic management on the metropolitan level. And also we are working with trains powered with hydrogen or even with batteries. So I think that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very focused presentation. Before we move to Professor Dodson, I liked your initial kind of statement that the Stuttgart region loves cars. And my question is Stuttgart region going to love electric cars? Is it something that is an issue of, let's say, prestige as the sports cars used to be? So is it now good to have an electric car and show that you have one and you use one?
Oh, frankly, I think that the turnaround and the most important point was when Porsche introduced an electric driving chain to the Porsche 911. So that was, everybody said, okay, that probably we're gonna love electric cars too. And then the others, as long as they have a star on it, we are okay with them.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you very much. So Professor Dodson, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Panagiotis. Allow me to thank you for organising this session, and congratulations to you and your colleagues for the event. Melbourne is quite a car-dependent city. About 80% of travel across the Melbourne metropolitan area occurs by car in normal circumstances. So we're probably not quite as bad as most American cities, but much more car-dependent than most European or Asian cities. But COVID, obviously, because of the lockdowns and the restrictions on movement, affected travel patterns in Melbourne quite markedly. We had two major periods of lockdown in the second half of 2020 and the second half of 2021. And so if we look at mobility patterns, which on the left there are depicted by the Google mobility data for Melbourne, we can see that driving, walking and public transport declined markedly from March 2020. There were periods when they rebounded a little bit when we came out of the first lockdown. Then they declined again. As we've gone in and out of shorter and longer term lockdowns, they've gone up and down. We're getting close now that we've come out of the most recent lockdown and we're fairly free to move and to go to work and to go to other kinds of activities. Automobile travel has largely rebounded. Walking activity, not quite so much, but public transport is still around 40 to 45% lower than it was pre-COVID. And that's a significant change in travel behaviour since before COVID. And it's a particular concern because obviously there's less fare revenue going into the public transport system to cover the costs of operations with that travel down. Now, if we also look at across the city how changes in car mobility, for example, have been manifest, we find that there are important internal differences in parts of the city where car mobility has rebounded and areas where it has remained comparatively lower. So in Melbourne, our public transport network is very radial. Most of the rail lines serve the very centre of the city. So in this chart on the right-hand side, the areas where the darkest green dots are, that's the centre of Melbourne, the CBD. Our public transport networks tend to be of less quality in the outer suburban kind of corridors. And so this chart is showing differences in use of cars as measured by traffic light signals on the road network, and comparing late 2021 to late 2019. What we can see is that the inner urban areas and some of the inner suburban areas to the southeast of the city have not regained the level of car mobility that they had in 2019, whereas many of the outer suburbs, those areas in red and orange, have seen a noticeable rebound. Now, this geography of different travel patterns partly reflects the kind of socioeconomic geography of Melbourne. In those inner urban areas and inner southeastern areas, a much higher proportion of the population works in professional jobs, and they're able, in many cases, to be able to work from home just with a computer. In the outer suburban areas, those red and orange areas, we see a much higher proportion of people whose work involves actually having to go to a workplace, whether they're in manufacturing, freight and logistics, other kinds of service work. So the patterns of mobility, and this is in this case car mobility, are quite differentiated in terms of the relationship between people's travel mode and the kind of working roles that they have and where they live within the city. Next slide, thanks. So some of the causes behind these different travel patterns in Melbourne, obviously the long lockdowns have affected us severely. Some calculations suggest that Melbourne has been the most severely locked down city in the world. I'm not sure that's quite the case, but we've certainly been among the most locked down in terms of travel restrictions. We've seen considerable changes in work practices, particularly remote working but also people reducing the days in which they do commute, and that particularly affects public transport. We've seen hesitancy about COVID-19 transmission on public transport networks, even though the evidence that COVID is often transmitted by public transport or on public transport is actually fairly weak. I haven't seen very many studies that have been able to confirm that that occurs. There's also been less congestion on the roads, so people see that it's actually easier to travel around by car, so perhaps they choose car travel over public transport because it's a bit quicker. And also we have seen unemployment, so people have been out of work and therefore not making work-related travel. And just another way of looking at the relationship between car dependence and social vulnerability in Melbourne. This chart on the right-hand side is a chart of a combination of households that are either socioeconomically affluent in relation to their car use, or socioeconomically less affluent in relation to car use. So the poorer households that are also highly car dependent are depicted in the darker red shades, and the households that are wealthier and less car dependent are in the greener shades. So we can see that there are quite stark differences even before COVID in terms of car dependence and wealth or income. And those patterns seem to be affecting the way travel behaviour is working after COVID, or in the late COVID period. And we're not quite after it yet. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of transport interventions and policies that are being put into place in Melbourne, there's been a really strong focus on short-term, relatively small-scale interventions, capitalising on the fact that because of lockdown, there's been and we've had limitations in terms of how far you could travel. For much of the lockdowns, we've been not allowed to travel more than 5 kilometres, and only for a limited number of regions. And that's meant that local lifestyles and activities have become very localised. So a lot of our short-term interventions are focusing on enhancing and enabling sustainable transport at the local scale through such interventions as supporting new pedestrian spaces, cycling infrastructure, kind of pop-up, we call them bike lanes, taking space away from roads and providing it to pedestrians and cyclists, and also street reclaiming through what have been called parklets. So because there have been limitations on restaurants and cafes in terms of how many people can be inside them due to COVID restrictions, a lot of local governments have been allowing those cafes and restaurants to take over parking spaces outside of the restaurant and convert that to dining space. So in the figure on the top right there, you can see some umbrellas and a little dining area that's been built outside a restaurant on the street, taking away parking from cars. And it's been very interesting to watch this phenomenon, because in normal circumstances, retailers and cafe owners and restaurateurs think that car parking is essential to their business because that's how their customers get there, even though the research shows that's not the case. Most of them walk or cycle or use public transport, but there's been a strong belief that car parking is essential to the business. Now they're advocating for removing parking so they can put tables and chairs out on the street in order to keep their business going under COVID restrictions. So there's been some very interesting turnarounds there. Then if we look to some of the longer term planning that's been going on, and some of the stimulus that the government has been putting in relation to transport, Melbourne has been a very fast growing city by comparative standards within developing countries over the last couple of decades. The city has been growing at about 2% per year for almost a decade. We're currently at about 5 million and expect to be at 10 million by 2050. So there has been a long-term program of investment in major infrastructure projects. And despite the impact of COVID on public transport travel, the state government, which has responsibility for infrastructure in Melbourne, has been continuing and accelerating its program of major infrastructure development. in part because it provides economic stimulus. So putting money into construction provides jobs for construction workers, keeps them employed, and obviously has ongoing economic effects. But also some of the projects that are being invested in are very long-term capacity orientated projects. So there's a big $50 billion project that's just starting called the Suburban Rail Loop, which is going to provide an orbital rail line through the middle suburbs of Melbourne, where the government is investing in a new rail line to Melbourne Airport. And there's a number of other projects that I haven't listed here. But these are intended to provide longer term capacity. So as Melbourne potentially returns to a long-term growth trajectory in terms of population, these are projects that don't have a short-term impact. The value of them will be felt 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years down the track. So the government is still quite comfortable in investing in those projects despite the short-term decline in public transport use. And these are also projects that will help reshape the city structure over the long term, particularly the Suburban Rail Loop, by enabling new development to occur around some of those suburban stations. So it's been quite an interesting experience in Melbourne, this relocalization of travel behaviour and lifestyles, but with still a long-term infrastructure development program occurring in the background with a view to 2030, 2040, 2050, and so on, when hopefully COVID will be a distant memory. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Dodson. Very, very interesting. Let me just inform the attendees that they can ask the questions through the Q&A box. We already have a couple of questions. I'll get to them in a couple of minutes. First of all, I wanted to ask, and starting kind of going backwards, some kind of short points from our panelists, and starting with Professor Dodson. Are there particular segments of the population in Melbourne that are disproportionately affected by the limited access to the public transport and all these difficulties?
Yes, that's right. So, and I think my second slide, I showed an image of the urban structure of the city in terms of car dependence and household vulnerability. And so the households in those outer suburban areas have relatively poor access to public transport. And as a consequence, they tend to have very high rates of car use compared to the wealthier households in the inner urban areas who tend to have much better access because public transport was originally constructed around the centre of the city and then expanded outwards. But then after the Second World War, when the automobile took over, the construction of services or public transport lines didn't continue to the same pace it had. So we have quite an uneven structure within the city. And when you add the impacts of COVID, there are quite disproportionate effects that run across both location, but also household socioeconomic status, including types of job and levels of employment.
Thank you. Mr. Kiewit, is it also like this in Stuttgart?
So as I mentioned, there is no cut down in services. So everybody has access to public transport, despite that people start working from home. So I think the significant drop in ridership is due to students. As we operate the metro railway system, students are our most important customers because they have no alternative available, they have no car available, so they rely absolutely on public transport. But as students have been done teaching from home, so there was quite a lot of students are not going to university, are not going to school. So that's the significant share that led to a drop in ridership. Every adult has a car available, and as we rely on jobs in factories, people have not been able so much to work from home. They have to go to their assembly line. So the whole drop in ridership can be traced back to students, and nevertheless, that's very important for them.
Great. Ms. Kadepalli, the same question to you. Are there specific segments of the population in India or in Chennai specifically disproportionately affected by the limited access to public transport that you have shown?
Absolutely. First keep in mind that people are a lot more
So your
dependent on
video,
public transport.
is there a way you can possible to switch on the video, because we'll have a better picture?
Sure. Let me see. As in, I've just lost power, but let's see.
Okay. No, leave it
Yeah.
like this then. It's okay. We leave it like this.
Sure. Like I was saying, see, first of all, keep in mind that in India, public transport usage is much higher as a percentage of all trips than many European cities and American cities. And the usage of car is extremely limited. So as per the last census, only 5% of trips in India were actually on car. So even in a city like Chennai, which is one of the more prosperous cities, the number of trips on cars is still less than 10%. And yet, they are congested. Now, as far as who's affected, the poor certainly are affected deeply because of public transport or lack of public transport services, especially women who depend a lot more on public transport than men do. So when we did a survey to find out how many people have access to private motor vehicles, we found that the access to private motor vehicles amongst women was much, much lower than what it was for men. And given that they were not having the access, many women, especially from lower income households, were not even able to access job opportunities. For example, if they were working as household helps, they could not actually reach their places of work. And even the families where they worked were afraid of their house helps coming on public transport. So, it was like a double whammy. First of all, there was no public transport. And if it was there, the employer did not want them to ride on public transport. So obviously this created a lot of problems. And of course, also public transport is used a lot by school children who get free passes and subsidized passes for college students. And since colleges and schools have been shut for all this period, even now, they're just starting to open up. Obviously, they were not using public transport for their daily needs. But what we did see in India, like in much of the world, is an increase in the number of people cycling. And so you can actually visibly see that number increase in Indian cities.
Thank you. And this is very interesting. And I think we can go now to one of the questions, or actually two of the questions that are very closely related to what you just said, Ms. Gedepali. We have a question from Sharat, who asks, what is the impact of metro rail project specifically in Chennai? And I think Bandish just in a way answered saying, why hasn't metro picked up in Chennai? So the question is, has the metro picked up in Chennai or not? And if not, why not?
So first of all, keep in mind that metro in most parts of the country has not done very well. As in, there might be exceptions like Delhi, which are showcased as successes, and rightly so, as in Delhi metro is doing quite well. But having said that, in other cities, whether it's Chennai or Kochi or Nagpur or Lucknow or Jaipur, the ridership has been extremely low. So just to put things in perspective, pre-COVID, when none of this was affecting transport, the number of daily riders on metro was about 100,000 people. 100,000 people. There were 3.5 people riding every day. And now there are various reasons, of course, for this. One is metro typically tends to serve longer distance trips, but most trips in Indian cities are actually shorter distance. 56% of all trips in Indian cities are under 5 kilometers, which means they're better served by walking, cycling, and public transport. And therefore, metro suits only a certain small percentage of trips. Two, metro is much more expensive, much more expensive than bus services. It was like pre-COVID, it was nearly about 4 times more expensive than bus services. And which meant that people could not afford. A lot of people who depend on public transport are actually from lower income households. And the third and last but not the least point is it also depends on, to a certain degree, on the level of congestion that you have on the streets. When you have very high congestion, then a certain proportion of the people then wonder that maybe they should be shifting to a metro because it might get them across the city. And that's why you would see a city like Mumbai having so many riders on the suburban rail. Even if the quality isn't the greatest, it still has a lot of ridership, because oftentimes that's the only means of getting to a certain place on time. Everything else is, you're just stuck in traffic.
Okay, so interesting. I mean, indirectly, you're saying that in the way that it currently works, the metro system would not be very helpful unless some significant changes are made. So let me go to Mr. Kiewit and see. I understand that in Stuttgart, I'm not sure if you have a metro or a light rail system, but what is, how do you put all these together, like the bus system? How do you ensure accessibility to all the population through the public transportation system? You're muted, Mr. Kiewit.
Sorry, I think most important is that we have an integrated tariff system. So you do not have to pay separate tickets for the metro. If you change to a bus, you have all in one pass. And you also can use rental bikes and e-scooters with the same passes. I think that's very important, that you have one integrated tariff system. And of course, for a long time, we really coordinated the development of the metro and the development of new settlements, of housing areas closely together. Our strong opinion is that we have the most increase in ridership when we can provide easy access from places where people live or where people work or where people want to go to shop. If these places are very good and comfortable connected to public transport system, I think that's very crucial. If you have people settle all over the place and you have to take a car or other means of transport to reach the metro system, that would be not good for the overall development of the ridership. So make it reliable, make it clean, make it safe, and make it easy accessible. I think that's quite crucial.
Thank you, Professor Dodson. What's the situation in Melbourne? I think over there you also have a train system or metro system as well.
Yes, that's right. Melbourne has quite a large metropolitan rail network. We also have the world's largest tram network, but those tend to be concentrated in the centre of the city. So all of the rail lines feed to the centre of the city. We don't have any orbital rail lines, and most of the tram network also goes to the centre of the city as well. So, and the tram network is most concentrated in the historical inner urban areas. Out on the periphery, in the post World War II, we call them suburbs. They're very car dependent, and they really only receive bus services unless they're close to a train line, and those services are infrequent, don't connect particularly well. So we see quite a differentiation in the city between households on the fringe or the outer suburbs and those in the inner city with good public transport access.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's move. We have a number of other questions here. One that is relevant also to the increase of use of private vehicles is the possibility of using electric vehicles, and also in the case, I see here an example from an anonymous attendee about hydrogen vehicles in Germany. But in general, do you see a trend? Shreya, you are eager to respond to that. Go ahead, please.
Let me say this, a car is a car is a car. So, an electric car is like Diet Pepsi, when regular car is like Pepsi, right? And we don't really know. And so the future cannot be the car, even if it's electric. The future needs to be walking, cycling, and public transport. Now, is there possibility of electrifying buses? The answer is yes. And I think we should certainly try to think about how we shift from fossil fuels to electricity as motive power, but it needs to be for buses, not for cars. We just need to get down with the number of cars that we have, and that's just cannot be the future.
Oh, Mr. Kiewit, I see you are ready to answer. I mean, as you said, you come from a region where car is part of the lifestyle.
Yeah, it is. But if you talk to the strategic development officers of the big car making companies, they well understood that there is no such thing as like go ahead. They try to think how to integrate cars in the urban pattern, how to provide services that really are in line with all the development goals, with all the climate protection goals. So I think, as Troy said, a car is a car is a car. And I think it's not about the emissions and not only about noise control and things like that. It's about the limited space we have in cities. And it's about the quality of living within the cities. But on the other hand, people are not on the road for fun alone. People are traveling and are in need for mobility because we have a totally situation that people do not work in the same place where they live. And especially if you have an economy that depends on industry, you cannot bring housing and working closer together. So our average commuter distance is 15 kilometers, about 7 or 8 miles. So that's not, that cannot be done easily by bike. Some people do this during the summer, but not in November and not in December. So half of the year, people rely on public transport. And that's why it's crucial that we really have in mind that if we want to have less cars, we have to increase the capacity of public transport. It's as easy as that.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I mean, you two agree that the increase in capacity of public transport, I think also Professor Dodson agrees on that. And I think this is also very relevant to the questions from the attendees regarding public transport challenges in Delhi about stagnant buses and so forth. But I mean, if you have a fleet, you have a fleet, you know that the fleet is underperforming, as Ms. Gadapalli said at the beginning. So you don't have enough buses in Chennai, right? So you have COVID and you cut the capacity in half in terms of how many people go into the bus, let's say, okay? So then you have a bigger problem. And what you're saying now is let's increase the buses. So you need so many buses. How will you fund all this? Where will you find all the financial resources? I'm starting with Professor Dodson there, and then we go back to everyone.
Yeah, so in terms of improving services, I mean, that's a long-term challenge for a city like Melbourne, because we have these large service deficits in our outer suburban and peri-urban areas. In part, there's some institutional questions as well as simply rolling stock and infrastructure that we need to grapple with. The way our suburban bus services have been organised historically has been through kind of small areas carved up between relatively small companies operating buses according to contracts with the state government that haven't been revised for possibly decades. There is increasing discussion in Melbourne about using this moment as an opportunity to reform the way bus services are planned and delivered within the city, creating larger companies that can manage the buses with greater economies of scale, with higher service quality, and so on, and starting to improve those suburban bus services. So that's a big topic of discussion amongst planners, the transport planners in Melbourne at the moment.
I'm having some connectivity issues. Unless you cannot, yes, okay. Mr. Kiewit, you want to address this question as well? I had some.
Yes, of course. I think we have to make clear that increasing capacity in public transport is a very expensive issue. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money to create new metro lines, to have more rolling stock out. So this is expensive. But we mentioned in our discussion before the official start of the program about the spring flood we had in Germany a few weeks ago. The damage done there will sum up to 30 million euros. And if you expect more heavy rainfall, flooding because of climate change, we have to take this amount of money into consideration. So after all, it can be way cheaper to have a sustainable mode of transport instead of coming up for all the risk, taking all the risk and pay the damage that has been caused by heat waves, by droughts, by floods, by all these things. So, but frankly, policy has to prepare the money that is needed. Sustainable public transport system does not come for free.
Ms. Gadepalli, floor is
Yeah,
yours.
so, we often tend to think in silos, right? So when we think about creating a metro system or creating a highway, it's called an investment. But when it comes to buses, they're somehow expected to break even on their own. Somehow they are supposed to be running as a business. And this has been the case in Indian cities, but many parts of the world, right? It's perfect. There's pretty much no metro system in the world, no rail system in the world, which breaks even. The government actually has to put money to make sure that it keeps running every single day. But when it comes to buses, somehow the same government says, if you break even, you manage to do it yourself, or private sector is supposed to run it on its own as a for-profit business. And this is just a question of how we think about public transport services. There's this stepmotherly, stepfatherly behavior, so to speak. Now, look at the cost. For building 2 kilometers of metro in an Indian city, you can get 1,000 new buses, not 1, not 2, 1,000 new buses. So for every 2 kilometers of metro not built, we can add 1,000 buses. So Chennai built 45 kilometers of metro, and what it needs is 3,000 buses. So essentially, if Chennai did not build 6 of those 45 kilometers, it would have actually offset the entire deficit of buses and provided a much better quality of service in the city. So I'm not saying don't build metro. Sometimes some lines maybe build a metro, but you got to put money first in buses and only then think about metro, because we have cities in India which have not even a single bus service, not even a single bus, but they have a metro all right. So it almost seems like it's a Disney ride in the city. So that's part one. I don't want to be bashing metro here, but I think we need to be clear about it. The second thing is about highways, right? We're just perfectly fine building highways and elevated roads and flyovers, as they're called in India. And each one of them, again, costs the same amount of money. You build a 2 kilometer elevated road, it costs the same amount of money, like about 1,000 crore rupees. You could easily use it for buses. And last but not the least, I think it's time that we start spending money, not spending money, but actually charging money on car usage. When we did an assessment in Chennai, we found that every year, if Chennai starts managing its parking, it can earn close to about 400 crore rupees. Now, 400 crore rupees is something like $60 million. That's a lot of money, right? $60 million can easily fund a lot of bus infrastructure in the city and a lot of better walking and cycling infrastructure in the city. And the second thing that cities could do is certainly congestion pricing, especially the larger of the cities, where there's significant amount of money to be made, not just significant amount of money to be made, as in even, I wouldn't say that a city should implement congestion pricing for the money. It should be doing congestion pricing to reduce the number of cars. But there's also money that's coming in that you can get to reinvest in public transport. We've actually done a study for Mumbai of how to implement congestion pricing. Happy to share that offline if somebody's interested.
So there is a relevant question by Rishi Agarwal about saying specifically COP26 just got over through a carbon and congestion tax. Let's pay the true price for cars and not the subsidized ones. Okay, let's accept that. You, Ms. Gadepalli, just indicated you think that's feasible. Is it feasible in Germany? Do you think that people are willing to pay? And also to you, Mr. Kiewit and Mr. Dodson, as we gradually going towards the end of our event, Mr. Kiewit.
So I think people have been well aware that they have to invest money for mobility. We had a discussion here that some cities started to make public transport free of charge. You pay nothing if you want to use it. But at the end, if you have a closer look at it, people are not so much waiting for a very cheap system of transport. They're waiting for a system of transport that is reliable, safe, and clean, because otherwise you cannot make people let their car in the garage and use public transport. So there's also the question, can we achieve the quality standards that people accept from public transport? And just to add to Shreya, I'm strongly an advocate of metro railway systems because of the capacity. Of course, it's expensive, but we are able on one railway track, within 1 hour, we can transport a capacity of 1,000 buses. So if you have to start with building up a public transport system, buses are way faster and way easier to achieve. But if you have also some tracks available and you make them really efficient, you can transport way more people. And of course, if you have not a separate bus lane system, the bus are struck within the congestion like a car. And I think that the huge advantage of railway tracks is that you are not stuck in the traffic jam, that you can really predict that the traveling time, that's especially during rush hour, it's a huge advantage. As you know, when I take a train, I'll be there in 10 or 15 or 20 minutes. If you use a car, you have to calculate an extra hour to get there. So I think that's also very, very important.
Thank you. Professor Dodson?
Yes, the question of congestion pricing is a very interesting policy topic in Australia, partly because we have 80% of travel in our cities is undertaken by automobile. There's a continuing pressure for government to continue to build major roads, whether it's motorways or major arterial roads. And there's a very strong view amongst many of the policy agencies in Australia at both our federal level and at state level that car drivers should be paying the full cost of their the impact of their travel on both the environment in terms of carbon, but also the full cost in terms of the externalities on the city, including congestion. One of the difficulties, though, is many of the electorates within our political system that tend to switch between one side of politics and the other at the elections tend to be some of the most car-dependent electorates. So when you have 80% of travel by car, and many of those car-dependent electorates can be decisive in choosing who forms government at an election, politicians are very sensitive to questions of pricing car use in cities or putting a charge on car use. However, with the increasing policy development around electric vehicles, we're starting to see in some states, and in Victoria, the state of Victoria where Melbourne is located, has put in a policy that as electric vehicles become adopted, there will be a per kilometre road user charge imposed on them of 2.5 cents per kilometre. Now that road user charge is a state-based charge that will replace the federal fuel tax, because electric cars won't pay fuel tax. And that road user charge will be set at about half the cost of the federal fuel tax. But what it will mean is that as we transition to a fully electric motor vehicle fleet, there will be a per kilometre road user charge on vehicles. And although it's set at 2.5 cents per kilometre at the moment, there's no reason why in the future it won't be able to be increased in order to manage car use in cities. And as we see increasing sort of GPS type technology in cars that can track where they are in the city, people in transport kind of research and planning are expecting that that technology will be able to be used to impose sort of area-based charging, like congestion charges on car drivers in the future. So, for example, you could say if your GPS detects that the car's in a certain area, you'll get charged a higher rate per kilometre. So we're sort of slowly using the electric vehicle transition to enable more rational pricing of road use and car use in cities.
Okay, thank you very much. We need to wrap this up, and in order to do that, what I will ask you, each one of the panelists, in one sentence only, and only in one sentence, I want you to tell us what is, in your view, the most important step that cities should take in order to reinstate public systems and non-motorized means as better ways of city transport in the post-COVID world. So in one sentence, please, how can we reach this objective? What is the most important step that cities can take? And I'll start in the reverse order from what we started from. Professor Dodson, one sentence only.
So we need, okay, it could be a long sentence. We need to capitalize on the opportunities that COVID has provided us in terms of, in the case of Melbourne, enabling greater local travel and living, while also planning for the long term when COVID is much less of an issue than it currently is, through investment in major infrastructure capacity for 2050 and beyond.
It was one sentence, yes, indeed.
It was one sentence, a bit long.
It is, some commas, but yes. Mr. Kiewit.
I would say focus on the hinterland, because people living in suburban rural areas are really that what makes the city run.
Thank you. Ms. Gadepalli.
Okay. I'd say better streets, more buses, better lives.
Thank you very much. I think we looked at the problem. We looked at the causes. We discussed some population issues and population segments that are negatively affected. We looked at some solutions. We also touched a little bit on soft drinks, which was very useful, but also at costs and potential solutions. I think there are two key messages. One also is integration of systems, and the other one is what you just mentioned, possibility to have different means of transport, whether these are buses, pedestrian, bikes, and so forth. So on behalf of the IURC program, and also take the liberty to say also from the Urban Works Institute, and the team that worked on this project, and especially Ansu, Prachi, Ashish, and Yo, I would like to thank the speakers and the audience for their active participation. For those of you that want to follow up on this activity, which is related to COVID-19, but also to the mobility thematic network of IURC, please come in contact with us, and we wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.